So welcome everyone. My name is Connie Pascal, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first of our MI Colloquium for the fall 2021 semester. So I'm delighted to have all of you come online, and welcome to our future video audience as well. So today we've got a real treat for you. We have information ecosystems, news media, and misinformation, what information professionals need to know. So we're going to start out by never get my screen to advance. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask Marie to come on and give us a welcome. Then we're going to hear from Professor Matthew Weber. We'll have a quick Q&A and then do some closing remarks. And then we'll actually hang out for another 15, 20 minutes after 1 o'clock so that you can also find out a little bit more about each other and also continue some of our discourse. So without further ado, I would like to also, of course, remind you of some meeting rules. Video available in 1 week on the MI playlist. Audience members will be muted throughout the presentation for the most part. And please put your questions in the chat for now, and I'll be monitoring those. So again, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Marie Radford. Marie, take it away.
Thank you, Connie. I got to see all my wardrobe of my red sweaters. That one had a high
You
neck.
have the best wardrobe of red sweaters. I admire them very much.
Oh, this morning I did dig out my cashmere. I have to say it's chilly in my house. We haven't turned on the heat yet. So good afternoon, everybody. And it is my deep pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Matt Weber, who's an associate professor in Sky's Department of Communication and a member of Rutgers NetSky Network Science Lab. He has more than a decade of experience teaching and researching information ecosystems, organizations, and communities. His current research focuses on algorithms and knowledge, public policy processes, production of media, and the science of communication within information ecosystems. Matt's work has been well funded by a number of organizations, including the National Science Foundation, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, the William T. Grant Foundation, the Democracy Fund, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. He's been using mixed methods, including social network analysis, archival research, and interviews to collect data. One of the things he's been doing is developing a new methodology for using large-scale data sets for tracing organizational processes, as we will learn more about today. He's going to be discussing how recent studies in misinformation are highlighting the ways in which our information ecosystems are being manipulated for both good reasons and for nefarious purposes. The dark side. This talk will focus on helping you knowing which is which is a vital skill for, that's two witches in one sentence.
I wonder.
A vital skill for all information professionals. He's going to help us unravel the complicated relationship between information ecosystems and policy, and show us how to work with archived internet data so we can build our own information ecosystems research databases. So I'm very excited that he's our colloquium speaker today. I'm now going to turn the Zoom screen over to Matt.
Matt, while you're getting ready, I remember, so this is a reprise of, Matt gave a colloquium for us, I think back in 2016 or 17, something like that, a few years ago. And it seemed at that point in time, the thing we had to worry about was whether or not the White House, the Bush administration had changed like web pages back on. So things have progressed since then. So again, great pleasure to welcome you to our colloquium stage again. Matt Weber, take it away.
Thank you for having me back. I'm just making sure I've got my screen set. Thank you, Marie, for the kind introduction. Marie's office sits across from mine in normal times, and it's been strange and bittersweet to be back at Rutgers because I keep coming into campus and I don't get to see my colleagues. So this is actually the first time that I've seen Marie in a bit.
Oh.
This is very nice.
Other than big meetings, right?
Yes, other than large Zoom meetings where we're all just like this, little squares on the screen. I'm Matt Weber. I'm in the Department of Communication. I am very excited to be here. I'm also somewhat self-daunted to think that I've been doing this for a decade and studying this topic for a decade, but at the same time, really excited to share updates on the talk that I gave in 2017, updates on the research, and be able to talk to you about some of the implications of the work that I'm doing. As I go through today, I will do my best. I've got a clock in front of me. I'll do my best to stick to time. As questions come up, I do keep the chat window open in this Zoom era. So if you have questions, feel free to pop them in. I'll try to keep an eye on them, but also happy to take questions and discuss at the end. In particular, my goal today is to talk about information ecosystems, news media, and misinformation. I'm going to talk a lot to you about how we map and understand information ecosystems. And I would say, as we go through that, think about, I'm going to point to a lot of the connections to policy and a lot of the connections to misinformation, but I challenge you also to think about those connections and think about questions that you have in the space. So we'll use that as our jumping off point. I'm going to give you a little bit of framing, and I apologize, maybe half apologize. I'm going to talk a little bit about theory first. And I'm going to do this for a very important reason, because it helps to set a framework for what I'm talking about. I approach most of my research through this lens of what we refer to as institutional theory. And you don't need to know a whole lot about institutional theory, other than for the purposes of what we're talking about today, helps you to understand how I'm asking the questions that I'm asking. I'm looking at the world of information, the world of new media, and the world of news media through this structural lens of wanting to understand how we build new practices, new norms, new routines. And in that, trying to understand core questions like, how do we, as individuals working within complex media environments, engage with disinformation, with misinformation? How does new policy at kind of a higher level form in response and in adaptation to disinformation, misinformation, and changing institutions? And so this lens gives me a really useful framework for starting to tackle big questions about what happens in the complicated jumble that we face every day of social media and news media today. I mean, arguably, this has become an incredibly messy landscape of various social media platforms, each of which is sharing different types, different forms of content, and which is layered upon our traditional media ecosystems of broadcast television, of local news and national news within this country. Now, it would be really nice if media ecosystems were this orderly space where we could see the connections that exist between each of these platforms, and everything fell into sync with one another. Unfortunately, this world, this jumbled mess of social media, is a much more accurate description as compared to the orderly image that I show you here. Now, the core challenge for me is that I, in my work, really strive to understand how these systems have developed. And I'm lucky now in that I've had the advantage of time to collect and aggregate data to begin to understand the space. But the critical challenge for so many of us, for so many of you, is that if you want to understand, for instance, how Facebook has developed and impacted local news media today or national news media today, it's really hard to do that. We don't have a DeLorean that we can hop into and travel back in time to see how were these decisions being made? What did these platforms look like? And so that's where I've been spending a lot of my time as a researcher to better develop methods and research approaches for examining how these institutions have developed over time. When I say these institutions, I'm talking about how local news organizations have developed over time, how national news has evolved, how social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter have come to impact our news media environment. And these are really critical questions, because when we talk about disinformation today, when we talk about misinformation, we need to be able to understand the complexity of the media landscape. There are a lot of researchers at Sky, a lot of researchers nationally who are doing work around misinformation, looking at specific questions of how consumers engage with misinformation, how we recognize whether information we're engaging with is accurate, inaccurate, intentionally inaccurate. But we haven't done as good a job as an academic community of understanding how users, how individuals engage with disinformation in the broader complexity of our day-to-day information diaries, our day-to-day information landscapes. And so that's really what this work is attempting to address. And I'm going to go through now and tell you a little bit about the methodology and the background, give you an introduction to why I see this as such an important approach, and then delve into some of the findings that have come out of this work and talk to you at the end about some of the future directions and questions that we're left with. So to start with, I do a significant amount of my work working with web archives. Web archives take a variety of forms. Traditionally have thought about web archives as web page archives, but we have so many different forms of web archived content, Twitter data streams, aggregations of video content, text records of online conversations, all different forms of web archives that are in some form or another available to researchers. Arguably, Twitter has opened up one of the biggest archives that we have with regards to social media, with their rehashing of the Twitter API and their decision to allow researchers access to archival tweets. When I look at web archives, I see these as an incredibly useful tool, not only for understanding how individuals engage with their information landscape, but also for mapping and understanding the broader meso and macro information landscapes that we engage in as consumers of media. In the research space, web archives have, even since the talk that I gave in 2017, really started to take on a life of their own as a research data source. There's research spread across disciplines that has talked about questions related to web archives. There are entire conferences now that have tracks that really focus on web archives, Web Science Conference being one. There are a number of journals and books that have come out on this topic. And there are journal articles spread across disciplines that leverage web archives, from astrophysics to computer science to information science and communication. Now, we're not talking about the old way of web archives. We're talking about a new approach to web archiving in here, and give you a little insight to what that looks like. When I talk about the old way, we're talking about archivists engaging with the retrieval of traditional information from things like microfiche. Those are traditional archives that we think of. Modern web archives are large repositories of various forms of data. This is actually a snapshot of tweet collections that are available in Events Archive, eventsarchive.org. I do not think the URL is currently live. Speaking of web archiving, they ran into a hosting problem last week, and I know that the archive has been down, but Events Archive is a wonderful repository of social media data around critical events that have occurred in the US over the past 10 years. When I say critical events, they track things such as earthquakes, hurricanes, natural disasters, major news events, and create Twitter and social media repositories around those events. Web archives have become really important today for tracking and understanding the development of coverage around COVID-19. National Institutes of Health, in partnership with the National Library of Medicine, has created a custom archive archiving content pertaining to the coronavirus disease and providing a record of the way in which coverage around and media responses to COVID-19 have evolved over the past couple of years, creating a really critical record for us to understand the world around us as it's evolving. And thank you, Connie. Events Archive is back up and running. I didn't get a chance to check that today. There are other examples of web archives that are worth paying attention to. I always point interested practitioners and scholars alike to a group called DocNow. DocNow is a wonderful group that seeks to create ethical collection and ethical curation practices and aims to archive and create repositories around media events pertaining to inequality. But in addition to that, they also have, you'll notice it on my screenshot here, a wonderful collection of tools that enable practitioners to work much more easily with web archives. And so DocNow is a wonderful research tool and practice tool. Web archives take on a variety of forms. Many countries outside of the US actually have national archives. This is the Portuguese National Library web archive. This is the Danish National Library. There are also research tools that are really useful, like the Memento project, which is run out of Old Dominion University. And actually, Old Dominion has created what they call the Memento extension for Chrome. And so if you're really interested in this topic, or let's say you just have a need or a desire to preserve web content individually, Memento actually allows you to create your own individual web archive. And I work with a number of peer researchers and peer practitioners who use Memento for various reasons to archive and store their own content on the web page. So if you download this extension, you'll have a little button that shows up in the top right of your browser, and you can click that button anytime, and the web page that you're on will automatically be stored to your computer. And so this has become, for instance, a really useful tool for researchers and practitioners seeking to store and archive social media content, because you're able to grab and pull down a page when you're on it. I've worked extensively with a tool called Archives Unleashed and been intimately involved with this project over the past 5 years. Archives Unleashed is a project that is now integrated with the Web Archive. The Web Archive, or archive.org, is the largest repository of web archive content that we have in the world, essentially. It's a nonprofit organization run out of San Francisco that aims to create a free public library of the web. They have a variety of other content that's available. I talked extensively about this in the prior talk, and I highly recommend, if you're not familiar with the Web Archive, that you take a little bit of time to check it out. But why Archives Unleashed is really useful is it's a set of tools that works within an archive that allows practitioners and researchers, actually was designed specifically for librarians, to access and to retrieve summaries of archived web content. And so for me, it's been really useful because it's allowed me to work with archives that I've built over the years to retrieve and download data so that I can examine media information ecosystems. And I use this tool and the suite of tools particularly to understand how local news in this country has been evolving over the past decade. Local news is an institution that has changed dramatically. If we were in person, I would ask everyone who is present today, and maybe you can in the chat, to tell me in 1 or 2 words where you're getting your local news today. What sources are you turning to for local news? And if people want to, please feel free to put it into the chat, because I am always curious. You're my research subjects for today. But increasingly, that is not a local newspaper. And increasingly, it's not even, I saw someone quickly mention Tap Into newsletters, it's not even our local news websites. It's much more what I'm starting to see pop up with people following local journalists on Twitter, people following Facebook groups. Local Patch has taken on kind of a life of its own. That's an interesting piece of the local news puzzle. Connie's like me, we're a little bit traditionalist. We still rely on the Star Ledger for some of our local news. But it's increasingly not what we would think of as the traditional news sources. And in part, we're seeing that new technology is being introduced and has been steadily being introduced into our media environment over the past 20 years. We're seeing that our routines as journalists for producing news are being dramatically disrupted by technology. Consumers are shifting how they consume local news. And this is leading to an ongoing and rapid disruption of the local news media environment. And the ramifications of that are incredibly wide reaching. There is no shortage of research that points to the importance of local news. Local news is a key driver of how attached, how close we feel to our local community. It's a key predictor. Consumption of local news is a key predictor of engagement in civic affairs, civic politics. a whole host of effects that come out of local news consumption. Local news consumption is directly related to our ability to combat misinformation, disinformation. I use those two terms. So misinformation, it's kind of false, misleading information that circulates either intentionally or unintentionally through our media systems, or it's disinformation is more, I'm going to say, a weaponized form of information where it's intentionally being used or wielded to create turmoil or create disruption in our media space. Local news consumption is critical to combating that. Local news consumption has long been the last bastion, the last defense against misinformation. It's been a space that really has been relatively robust in preventing or being somewhat immune to the dissemination of local news, in part because it's kind of the last level of the local news, of the news environment. Think about misinformation comes in, has largely come in through social media spaces, has come in a little bit, trickled in a bit through national news, but it's taken a while for that to drip down into the local news space. But as this disruption continues to evolve, as we start to see local news increasingly being weakened and traditional local newspapers increasingly fading away, we've seen a significant decline in terms of both the production of local news over the past decade, and really key to this conversation, the production of original local news over the past decade. We've seen a real decline in that. It's really forcing a dramatic change in our media, our daily media diet, and our local news media diet. There's incredible policy connections here and policy implications in understanding this. Talk more about the policy decisions right now. We'll talk about the implications at the end. We have consistently seen, particularly under the prior White House administration, but we're still seeing the after effects of that today. The FCC passing a series of rules that have weakened local media ownership regulations and have opened the door towards increased aggregation of local news outlets. And as that happens, we start to see local news becoming something that's aggregated up to more of that regional level. So we're starting to see exactly that happening. And as that happens, there's an opportunity that's created. As you have fewer local newspapers, consumers, like all of us, are still looking for information about their communities. And so we're turning to the online space. You're turning to social media, you're turning to following local newspapers, local journalists on Twitter, and it becomes increasingly hard to identify what is actually truly local news. And case in point, if you are familiar at all with the case of Metric Media, Metric Media is an example of what we call, has been and is referred to as pink slime in local news. It's sludge that looks like local news, but isn't quite local news. Metric Media is a shadow of an organization that's run by a small company that's popped up. Now, the last count was upwards of 900 local news websites across the United States. And these local news websites, it's a term I should use very loosely, so not really local news sites. Rather, they are sites that largely use algorithmic content production to mass produce local news stories that look like true local news content, but are often quite misleading and really help to accelerate the dissemination of local news into many of our communities. The challenge in studying this space is that, first of all, it's very hard to distinguish one local news source from another and understand what actually is local news. The other problem is that we don't really understand what constitutes a local news ecosystem. And so kind of core to my research is this question of what actually is in our local news ecosystems. And the short answer is, I'd say 95% of the time, we collectively, you as consumers, me as a researcher, we don't know. We often have a very poor understanding of what media outlets are available to consumers within a given community. So a core component of the research that I've been leading has been mapping and identifying the outlets that are relevant within a local news ecosystem. The original work that I started on about 5 years ago on this looked at, continues to look at 100 communities across the United States. Focused in this research on communities that qualify as small to medium size based on US Census data. The idea was to get a broad sample of kind of medium-sized bread and butter communities in this country. If you look at the census data, that's about 2,000 communities. That's far beyond the scope of what I could realistically accomplish, what the research team I worked with could realistically accomplish. So we took a sample of 100. Across these communities, and for each of these communities, we searched Google, we searched Bing, because we got to check multiple sources here. We also used a data source called Cision, which is a public relations database, to search and identify the local news sources that are available in each of these communities, and came up with a comprehensive listing of some 3,000 plus websites that cover these 100 communities. We're really restrictive in looking only within the community, so it was a somewhat focused search in that we were only looking within the bounds of the actual community. I recognize that when people are looking for local news, they often look beyond their individual community. We were trying to be very specific to what we were looking at here. And really mapping to understand the diversity of institutions that are represented and the replication and dissemination of local news content among these sources. This all falls under the purview of a project called the News Measures Research Project. And I briefly want to show this page, and I'm happy to disseminate the URL to make the point that all of the content that we've collected in this project is publicly available. So all the websites are aggregated and made available through this web interface. Someone asked an interesting question. I'll comment on it now while I'm on the data page. Someone said, has Nextdoor taken over as a local news source? And I would add Nextdoor into my list that I was referencing earlier, where I talked about Facebook and Twitter and some of the other local news sources that come into here. One of the interesting things that happens when we start to engage in this type of web data collection and we get this raw data dump of URLs coming in is we start to see pointers to all of these other sources. So we're not actually collecting Facebook data, for instance. It's very hard to get raw Facebook data, but we can see how much these stories are pointing to Facebook. And we can take these URLs and we can actually search Facebook's CrowdTangle tool to see how much they're being circulated on Facebook. We can do the same thing with Nextdoor. We can see references to local news sites back and forth, vice versa. Now, Nextdoor has become a very prominent, Facebook and Twitter have become very prominent local news sources, but at the end of the day, much of the content that's circulated on these sites is coming from the local news sources that we're talking about here. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing where many of the social media outlets that are disseminating local news, some form of local news, are relying on content that is being produced by local news sources, like this example of Winona Daily News. And often we can find Winona Daily News articles being circulated within a Nextdoor community. Nextdoor is one, it falls into the group of Facebook, where it's very hard to actually get raw data from that organization. Nevertheless, it is part of the local news ecosystem. And this is just one more snapshot of the raw data that we have available. The News Measures Research Project is again open data, and you can download a multitude of different formats. One of my formats that I'm particularly fond of is that you can download the data in a social networks format, which allows you the ability to visualize and map a local news environment. And in this case, this is an aggregate map of the local news space, showing the link distribution and essentially just telling you that this local news environment operates much like every other web environment. You get a best of websites at the center and some hubs, communities that form out of the peripheral. It just gives you a picture to look at to understand that this is an incredibly complex and congested space of information exchange. There are 14 million domains that appear in this overall data set. When you dig down to the center to look at the heart of it, you find essentially what you would expect to find. You find social media platforms, Twitter and Facebook, really at the center of the web space. For me, the visualizations don't help a ton. It's the data that comes out. It's really particularly useful, but it gives you a way to understand the complexity of what you're looking at. What's really useful for me in this work is to be able to better understand the types of content that's available on here and what stories are being disseminated. So I'll say a little bit about that now. We saw it in understanding and mapping the local news environments that we're looking at these 100 communities, for example, to better understand the type of stories that were being distributed. So we took a sample of 16,000 stories from this data set and engaged in a process of hand coding. And that may run counter to some of what I've been talking about, because I've been talking so much about our reliance on big data and automation. But at the end of the day, you have to create a dictionary from somewhere, and you have to create a starting point. And so the starting point here was to work with an army of graduate students and undergraduates to manually code the content of these stories to better understand the type of information that's disseminated in our local news. So we coded 16,000 stories. We worked on a set of criteria that came out of University of Wisconsin from a group led by Lou Friedland. They conducted a literature review and analysis for the FCC, and they came up with what are called critical information needs. These are essentially 8 categories that local news serves to its communities. Be serving information about emergencies and risks, health, education, transportation systems, environment and planning, economic development, civic information, and political life. When we analyze these stories, about 20% of the content fell under the bucket of emergencies and risks, 37% fell under political life. Civic information, economic development were the next 2 categories, and then it kind of spread out across the others. But about half your information is politics and emergencies. Now, the second thing that our team looked at was whether or not the content that was being produced was actually about a local community, and whether or not it was actually original content. Now, the sweet spot here, if you're truly trying to create local content, is that the content's original, it's local, and it serves a critical information need. When we looked at all these stories, a 16,000 story bunch, we found that only 11% of stories actually hit that trifecta. Now, there's a secondary analysis that goes with this. In 2019, the research team, including myself and Phil Napoli down at Duke University, were granted access to a subset of data from Facebook. We actually got to see about 300,000 local news stories, local news links that Facebook categorized within the local news space. They shared with us data about the local news stories that they were distributing, where they were distributed, how much they were accessed, what groups they were disseminated through, giving us a snapshot of what their local news environment looked like. Now, the distribution of stories largely mapped onto what I was previously telling you about critical information needs. For the stories that we identified that were actually local news, about 50% were either about emergencies and risks or political life. There's a but on this, and this is where social media gets complicated. Of the 300,000 stories that Facebook shared with us, about half were stories that our team would not have qualified as local news. They were stories that fell under categories such as obituaries, stories about local sports, which, while interesting and important to a community, don't fall under the previous description of local news. And there were stories that fell into that pink slime categorization of being questionable as to whether they were even local news or whether they fell into the disinformation category. And that was about 10 to 15%, depending on the community. And so as we take this local news picture and we move it out into the social media space, we start to see that the door is open for an increasing amount of disinformation to enter into the landscape. This original snapshot focused squarely on content that we knew we could categorize as local news. But when that picture becomes more complicated, so does what is actually counted as local news. And we've generated from this a series of visualizations that help to map and identify the coverage of local news. The visualization in the top left seeks to show how local content is, and maps our outlets that we examined. The larger the circle, the more local the content is, the smaller the circle, the less local, and just starts to give you some visualization of what's actually being produced. We do know over time from the data that were analyzed as part of this study that content is increasingly not local within the space. The distances represented in coverage are increasing, and as a result, there is less and less of what we would actually consider purely local content that's germane to a community. All right, with the remaining time that I have, I want to talk very briefly about some of the limits on this work. And then I want to talk about the implications. So I'm not going to try to undermine myself, but I want to be clear about some of the challenges that are associated with working with data at this scale. So what are the critical challenges of working with this type of scope of web content is that we miss a lot. Anyone who tells you, anyone who would claim to say that they have archived the entire internet would flat out be spreading misinformation. It's incredibly hard to capture the entire web. So much of it's disconnected, so much of it lives in niches spread out across the internet. It's hard to really say that you've captured the full breadth of the internet. And so one of the questions I've asked in my work is how much is missing? And referencing an older study here, had an opportunity to look at data that was collected by our government, archives of Senate.gov and House.gov data. And when we looked at the links that were mentioned by Senate websites and House websites, what we found was that on average in the Senate, 64% of linked content was missing from the .gov archives that are maintained, these archives maintained by the Library of Congress. And when we get to House.gov, about 75% of linked content is missing. That means that more than 2/3 of content on average is missing, not included, missing from these archives, and points to clearly a significant challenge within this content. Other thing I'll say is that we're often missing dynamic content. Complex visualizations, videos, audio content is often very hard for these types of archiving programs, whether you're using something like the Memento or the web archives platforms to archive content. Here you're seeing a video that was live on the web, and then when you go to the archive, it's disappeared. The last thing I'll say, talking about institutions and things evolving, programming languages that we use on the web are constantly changing. And here I'll giving you a snapshot of the 2009 Greenpeace webpage. And the reason that I bring up this page is that in 2009, the Greenpeace webpage was awarded the Webby for best Adobe Flash implementation. And yet, when you get to the webpage that's archived, you can't actually access that content. All right, so I want to wind up by talking a little bit about implications. And I want to first say there's some really awesome resources out here that have leveraged web archive content to help make some of the implications clear. This is a site called Legex, which I would highly recommend spending 5 minutes exploring if you're interested in politics. Legex makes use of the Congressional Repository and Archive of Legislative Activity to track the passage of bills. And you can actually go back as far as, I want to say the 1990s. I would have to check again. It's been a little bit since I was on Legex's site. It allows you to look at the types of bills that were passed, when they were passed, how they were passed. Interesting baseline and implementation of web archiving to look at clear policy passage using web archive data. In the local news space, I think this type of mapping is particularly critical for understanding how our local news environments are changing and for understanding how policy actions implement that local news space. And right now, if you look across this country, there are more than a dozen experiments going on at the state level where politicians, policymakers are seeking to act to intentionally, let's say interfere, it's the wrong word, intentionally interfere and help to stimulate local news production. Here in New Jersey, we have the Civic Information Consortium with funding that's been made available to local news organizations to try to boost the production of original local news content. In Massachusetts in 2019, House Bill 181 was passed, creating the establishment of a commission to study journalism in underserved local communities with the intention as a subsequent action of creating policy actions that help to improve the health of local news in underserved communities. In order to understand how these policy actions actually impact local news communities, you have to be able to understand what's your baseline. What are we starting from? What do these environments look like right now? And that's kind of the missing piece in a lot of this. Work I'm doing here provides a baseline for this. And so right now I'm working, for instance, in New Jersey to track the impact of a civic information consortium and to see if funding coming into local news sources can actually change the type of content that's being produced. I'll give you a much broader implication, but one that I'm really interested in right now. And this is a project that's being initiated by the Department of Energy. And you might say, what does high voltage transmission have to do with local news? Well, the Department of Energy is really interested in understanding disinformation at the local level because they have seen over the past 4 to 5 years a number of instances where disinformation disseminated at the local level has caused panics, whether it's in the wake of a natural disaster like a tornado, or whether it's something as simple as rumors about rolling blackouts in California. Misinformation spread about the power grid has caused numerous instances where panic has led to overuse of the power grid, which has in turn led to failure of the power grid. And so the DOE is really focused right now on understanding the connection between the spread of disinformation at the local level and disruptions to our power grid. And so there's increasing attention on this idea of cyber physical systems, that there's a connection between our physical, our infrastructure, and what's going on within our local communities and how information is disseminated. I think it's a really good spot to end because it makes a very concrete connection between this idea of change at the local level, the micro level, and change at the macro level, and the connection between the two. Policy really sits in the middle as a bridge between these, and increasingly this local news space, and understanding this local news space through the use of web archives is a key mechanism for understanding disinformation and misinformation within our communities. And I'll end there. I'll leave my email up here. I'm always happy to respond to questions over email, over Twitter. Also want to acknowledge massive amount of support behind this work, whether that's from NSF, the Internet Archive, funding from Facebook, Institute of Museum and Library Services and Democracy Fund, or the numerous faculty and graduate students who are part of this research. This happens with the village. So I'll end there. I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to probe on any of these points further. Thank you everyone for being here today.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. I do have a quick question because as a researcher, it often, especially as a new researcher, you hear about all these tools, but can you just walk us through how you actually, if you're a brand new newbie, how you get started doing web? I mean, do you start with a design? What do you do? How do you get started?
Yeah, no, thank you, Connie. That's a great question. So I often point people towards archive.org as a starting point to begin to understand how comprehensive web archiving can be. If it's not something you're familiar with and you have a half hour to kill after you get off your conversation at 1:20, I highly recommend you go over and check it out. Not only is it an archive of web pages, the founder, Brewster Kahle, is a huge deadhead. He's built up the largest repository of archived Grateful Dead recordings in the world, live recordings on the website. They also have a series of emulators that allow you to replicate things like old video games. So if you ever played Oregon Trail in school as a kid, you can go onto archive.org and play Oregon Trail. Now, that's a nice way for understanding the different things that are archived. If you're really interested in understanding this as a information researcher, I really recommend the Memento plugin that I mentioned previously. It's a really nice add-on to Chrome, and it allows you to start playing around with the idea of preserving content and tracking how content's changing over time, because it's as easy as a click of a button. It sets up easily, allows you to store content, and I've had a lot of people use that as a starting point to creating their own repositories.
So how do you, well, I guess, how do you foresee these kinds of tools being used for information professionals? Do you see them being just for research in the scholarly way, or how would you use that, I guess, in a day-to-day corporate job, or could you?
Yeah, increasingly actually getting more and more queries from the professional space about archiving. Media organizations have been working on this technology for decades now. I mean, obviously, pretty easy to think about the use case for a media company. They want to be able to preserve and save their content. New York Times has built up one of the most robust information archives of their content that exists, and one of the most accessible archives of their content, something I've actually used in my own research. But increasingly, corporations, organizations have a variety of needs for archiving internal content and external content. For instance, we get queries and questions every now and then from pharma companies. You might think, why is a pharma company trying to archive social media content? Well, a lot of legal reasons. As pharma companies engage in increased external public communication via things like Facebook, they need to be able to archive and save the conversations that their employees engage with externally, because that's a huge legal question mark right now for these organizations. If you're talking, for instance, about dissemination of advertising around a medication, you need to be really careful and clear about what's being communicated. And so, interestingly enough, we've gotten a lot of inquiries from pharma companies about how to archive and what best practices for archiving are.
Cool. Lito has a question. Lito, if you want to go ahead and take yourself off mute and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. My question was whether videos or articles contribute more to the spread of local news?
That's a great question. I don't have a clear answer on that. What I can tell you is that in terms of the type of content that is disseminated, the majority of it is still word version articles. We tend to see far fewer videos in the archives. One of the easy things to do analytically is to check content type. And a relatively small amount of the content that's distributed at the local level is video content. I would hesitate to say a whole lot more because we did not explicitly analyze videos. It's incredibly complicated to analyze video content as a researcher. But I would say it's more articles still at this point because that's simply more of what's floating around right now.
Matt, could you stop sharing? We'd actually.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I should have noticed that. Thanks. So Matt, what's surprised you lately about misinformation, disinformation, or perhaps what's scared you the most or the least lately?
The last slide that I hit on really, it scares me to a certain extent. Maybe it doesn't surprise me, but it's not something that I've thought much about before the last year. This idea that the connections that exist between disinformation, which at first blush, I think many people thought was relatively harmless. Yeah, it introduced noise into our information landscape, but at first, a lot of people didn't take misinformation seriously. This idea that disinformation, intentional disinformation campaigns has a significant and major effect on our physical systems is frightening. The weaponization of disinformation and what that means for the next 10 years is something that, well, the research community has started to pay attention to. The implications are significant and somewhat frightening. Not to be too dystopic to end this talk, but it definitely raises alarm bells for me.
Marie, would you like to add anything at this point?
Oh, yes. Thanks, Matt. It is scary. I mean, and I think that navigating this ecosystem, as you're calling it, is just really difficult, I think, for everyone, for all of us, but particularly those of us who are in kind of the information industries, you know, where it's sort of our responsibility. It's kind of our responsibility to keep track of things. I just heard some interesting an interesting talk recently talking about information pollution, and also the idea that even sharing accurate information adds to that pollution by just kind of, we're just constantly sending out things, to our Twitter followers or, or people in our Facebook groups and so forth. And that information pollution, it's kind of fogging up. It's just, there's so much fog. And I think about, Matt, what you were saying about local news as well, that, and I think one of the questions that I frequently hear from my students and others in the library field is, how does one keep up? And you're saying it's really changing. the archiving practices. I think that was really extremely interesting that you're saying archival practices themselves have really changed so much. And so what might be your advice to our students about kind of keeping up and how to keep how to keep
Right,
on top of things?
exactly.
Yeah,
Ah, my.
I wish I had a magic bullet to answer that question. The challenge I've laid out for myself is a commitment to being a lifelong student in this space. And in part, I'll say selfishly, and I know that this won't answer the question, but I love interacting with my undergraduates because I'm always learning about what the new tool is for engaging with local news and engaging with media. And that's one of the hardest things to do, is to commit yourself to constantly learning and educating yourself about what the new technological platform is, what the new method for me, what the new method for archiving is, but for you as information professionals, understanding what the new mode for distribution is. Lito's question about video is an awesome one, because that's one of the big challenges right now. Content is shifting to video. And while I say that the bulk of content is still article based, yes, the short answer probably is that video is more successful in disseminating information. We just don't know how to handle that right now.
Right.
We don't know how to analyze that and account for that.
Yeah.
And so it's lifelong learning, lifelong challenges in the space.
Well, the deep
Yeah.
fake with video is so, again, because it looks so real and so in the moment, it is so difficult to discern. The news literacy organization in New York, we have a colloquium on them if you're interested, has great tools about teaching news literacy and actual vertical reading and horizontal reading, and how to try and source the information source. And information literacy is really kind of at the heart of some of this, right?
No, and they're an awesome organization for exactly that reason. Research in the past 18 months around misinformation has pointed continuously towards education as a key tool for combating the spread of misinformation. The reality is that once misinformation enters into an information ecosystem, there's little that we can do to combat its spread beyond education. And that's where the connection to policy is so important, because policy has the ability to set guidelines for education in this space. That's really going to be a key tool moving forward for combating the spread of misinformation.
So what about librarians? What should they be doing about this?
I would beat the drum that I just was beating of education. I think educating about what is accurate information. If we're going to live in a social media environment, helping our students, helping our peers to understand how to navigate through the myriad of information that you're overwhelmed with in an online environment, and to sort through, source, and vet social media content. It's incredibly hard to do, but increasingly an incredibly important key literacy skill for students.
Yeah, there's in the chat. So Lito made a following comment about modern propaganda is trying to overwhelm us, not persuade us, just kind of overwhelm us. So then you kind of get lost in that fog. And then Sharon had a question. I don't know if you could see it in the chat. A question about what role does amplification that social media affords impact local news?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is that social media affords local news a clear megaphone via social media platforms to increasing the dissemination of content. The downside of that is that as local news organizations enter into this space, they're increasingly competing with regional and national outlets. Now, you might point to things such as Facebook's local news initiative, where they're providing funding to local news organizations to help to boost their ability to navigate the space. And it's an interesting policy tool. But Facebook and Google both have these initiatives to help local news organizations to boost up their voice. I've got a graduate student, Sarah Wiley at University of Minnesota, who's been studying this. And what she's found is that when that policy tool is used, most of the funding actually goes to regional and national news organizations that are aiming to disseminate local news. So increasingly, we're finding that in that social media space, local news organizations are simply being outshouted and outfunded by regional and national sources. And So it's just becoming increasingly hard for them to compete in that landscape.
And
Nancy?
sorry, Connie, I was just going to add that outstaffed also. I think,
Yes.
you know, one of the issues, because I was saying in the chat that I read the Star Ledger and the New York Times. I get them both delivered every day, and that I see more and more content is coming from the national news services in the Star Ledger. It does
Yeah.
give me all the Rutgers news, so I'm not going to stop it, because it is really good about, you know, Rutgers news and local politics still. I'm sorry, Connie, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, invite Nancy Kranick to offer your comment if you're.
Oh, hi, Matt. Nice to see you. Hi, all of you. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you
especially
too,
since
Nancy.
it's been way too long. So my comment was about how we have each of these sort of professions has taken on its own literacies. Information literacy for the library profession, visual literacy, media literacy, news literacy. And, you know, it seems to me the only way we're really gonna make a forward momentum is if we start to bring all these literacies together into a more concentrated focus, because the real problem is not all the pieces. The real problem is a lot of what you've been talking about is as there's this convergence of all these different kinds of content, you know, we can't deal with pieces, but if we at least pulled together, it seems to me we could have really amplify our voices and start to make at least a little bit of an impact on how we can at least teach people, you know, which is what education is supposed to be about. Even if we can't change everything, at least we will make them better consumers of information, or whatever we're calling all this integrated stuff.
Nancy, that was a perfect closing comment. I'm going to now actually throw it to Marie to say goodbye, and then I am going to come back on and announce our November 11th colloquium. And of course, would like to take this opportunity myself to thank Matt for coming back for a colloquium. Marie, take us out.
Oh, okay. So I just, Matt, you've certainly given us a new perspective and something more to think about and helping us to stay current. And I learned a lot, and we've got a bunch of links that I was, you know, kind of copying down and to check out. And I think you gave us a lot of hints on where to get started with that. And I think sometimes just awareness of these issues, and then also some tools about how to get started on that. I think that's a very
Really helpful.
great and very helpful. Yeah, stuff to hear about. So again, just thank you again, Matt, for your presentation. And thanks to everyone who's in attendance today. I know there's a lot of competing overwhelm that we have on our time. And so it's all the more valuable to us, and we really have great attendance today. So thank you so much, really important topic. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Marie. I know you have to get to another meeting, so we'll see you on November 11th, and I'm going to actually share my screen because this is going to be our upcoming colloquium. And we are excited to announce that we have Jason Broughton, who is the director of the National Library Service for the Blind and Print and Disabled at the Library of Congress, is going to be our Beta Phi Mu lecture. Beta Phi Mu is the honor society for librarians in New Jersey, and this is a lecture that's sponsored by a number of different organizations, including Sky Alumni Association, the New Jersey Center for the Book, the LIS Department, and RU Libraries. Again, that will be on November 11th at 7 p.m. online. And with that, I'd like to wish everyone a good afternoon. We'll stay on for 5-10 minutes if anybody wants to hang out and chat for a while. If not, thank you, students and guests, and of course, Matt and Marie and all of our faculty. With that, see you later. Bye.